So, the question many people have been asking, even I myself, will war in human existence ever end? In my opinion, I'll say yes. The reason why I say yes is because a transition in years on Earth is gradual, has occurred in its fits and starts. People, of course, cannot expect a sudden or rapid change. Eventually, we will reach a state when war between nations for aggressive purposes will be abolished, such that no nation will risk the backlash and opposition of other nations in response, as has already occurred in 1991 with the opposition to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and in the 1950s with North Korea's invasion of South Korea. As material wealth increases and education becomes more widespread, the costs of war become prohibitive to nations and their citizens. As women have gained a voice, a vote, and influence, and levels of democracy have increased, we see greater opposition to war, greater concern for others, and greater tolerance. Think about how our collective views and attitudes towards war have changed. Today, most nations and people advocate for peace and oppose war, and such sentiments have increased over time. In some regions, such as the American Hemisphere, war between nations and even armed conflict within nations has become increasingly rare, and those rare events have often been relatively quick and short in duration as compared with the extended durations of the past in the more revolutionary eras during the colonial and post-colonial periods. Once upon a time, war and conflict was frequent, periodic, and widespread. Empires, nations, cities, and states fell and were destroyed or sacked. Even here in Africa also, there were continuous war between kings, between kingdoms, you see, back in the days. Now, expect for specific locations, such things are rare and increasingly infrequent. When we look back with greater vision and perspective, then we can clearly discern that the 20th century began its first half with terrible and destructive world wars, while the second half saw steady progress toward and realization of peace. This prior century fundamentally altered the arc of history and created the basis for eventual peace, as religious, racial, and national ideologies and intolerance have generally been on the decline and replaced with a more universal ethic that all lives matter and human rights are fundamental. That is not to say that we might not still see some simmering conflict. That is not to say that we might not still see some simmering conflicts. The nations are seen in Afghanistan and Syria, where oppression, repression, and intolerant ideologies have remained, and while dying, are often becoming more strident in their declines. No doubt such cultural fault lines will persist for perhaps another generation or two, just as racism has been dying and declining in the United States for the past 70 years, where it was once dominant in parts of the South and more rural and central regions. Eventually, those beliefs will wither and become unacceptable. There are similarly still potential conflicts and nationalistic tendencies, particularly in less democratic countries, that could lead to highly destructive conflicts. But given time, whether by gradual attrition and education or as a result of exhaustive conflicts like in Syria that make conflict increasingly unacceptable, most of the world and people will force peace and abolish war.